About, I think it's 2 years ago, I got a call from Pam, a forensic genealogist, who said that her research had shown that I was the granddaughter of a man named Jacob. And was that true? I was initially confused because I do not have a grandfather by that name. But then it dawned on me that she was referring to Kuba, my grandmother's longtime partner. Kuba and Zosha, my grandmother, had fallen in love after World War II and had immigrated to Israel, where they bought a house and they lived together until his death in 1972. I'd met him only once, when I think I was not quite 3 years old, on a visit to my grandmother with my mom. He gave me this little vanity case, which I immediately fell in love with because it made me feel grown up. And he kept asking my grandmother, "Isn't she the most beautiful, smartest child ever?" To the point that she told him to stop, lest I get a big head. Whatever the case, I never forgot him, and definitely knew that he loved me, I guess like a granddaughter, but I never thought to call him that. Kuba and Zosha were not allowed to marry in Israel for reasons that are way too complicated to go into right now, so they just quietly made a life together without the legal documentation. Once I realized that Pam was talking about Kuba, I tried to explain the situation. She told me that she was calling on behalf of a property developer in Poland who wanted to buy an apartment building in Kuba's hometown. He had owned 3 units in that building until the Nazis had stripped away all his property because he was Jewish. All these decades later, the Polish government required the property developer to trace and settle the property rights with all the heirs of all the apartment units that had remained unclaimed since the war ended. Could I prove the relationships between Kuba, my grandmother, and my mother were real? Well, it took several months, repeated trips to a notary, and lots of back and forth between my family and a genealogy team in Poland to gather up all the necessary documentation we could find: birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, wills, naturalization papers, passports, all that from Poland, from Israel, and from the United States, to prove that my mother was Zosha's daughter and heir, and that Zosha had been Kuba's heir, so that the property developer could satisfy the court that she had done her due diligence. Last August, Josh and I hand-carried several of these required documents to Poland because they had to be notarized there, and we dared not mail them and risk them getting lost. The irony, of course, was that my grandmother, in cahoots with a brave priest she was friends with, had forged baptismal and birth certificates for my mother during the war, making her a Catholic rather than a Jewish child, and that's what ensured her survival. The Polish government did legitimize my mother's birth certificate with the name change after the war. But every time we had to make yet another visit to the notary to prove that my mom was who the document said she was, we'd laugh at the complexity and craziness of the way documents based on a fiction were used to assure governments and bureaucracies that she was a human being. Under the Nazi regime, survival for her meant becoming the Catholic orphan of a deceased Royal Polish Air Force pilot, which my real grandfather definitely was not, while her own mother became her aunt. After the war, she became her mother's daughter again, but kept the Catholic last name. And while Kuba and Zosha never legally married, they did love one another and were faithful to each other for over 30 years. And Kuba loved my mother like a daughter, and me and my sister like granddaughters. All of these people and relationships were real, not because of documents, but because of love. I understand the need for legal proof of identity and documentation. We have to be able to demonstrate that we are who we say we are, so we can access what is legitimately and legally ours and be held accountable to the laws and obligations of our society. But I get nervous when documentation becomes a tool for denying certain groups of people the fullness of their humanity. Because governments, bureaucracies, and regimes can and do use documentation to legally dehumanize groups of people. The Nuremberg race laws created by the Third Reich allowed for the disenfranchisement and stripping away of all the rights of anyone legally designated a Jew by the government. It allowed the same thing to happen to Sinti and Roma peoples, homosexuals, people with disabilities, and other groups the regime didn't like. All of which paved the way for rounding up of people designated and documented in these categories into concentration camps. The Holocaust was immoral, but it was also legal. And this is not unique. We have seen this all throughout history, all over the world, and even here in our own country. The Constitution once had a clause which stated that people who were enslaved counted as 3/5 of a person, of a free person, when determining a state's population. Thus, why people who were enslaved were counted for the sake of determining the number of representatives for Congress, they couldn't vote. They were documented as property to be bought and sold. Homosexuality used to be a crime, as well as a documented mental illness. It took generations for people of color and for women to get the constitutional right to vote, and decades more to ensure that that right was actually allowed to be exercised in all 50 states. There are many other examples I could offer, but I think you get the idea. The recent slew of executive orders by the current administration is working to legally disenfranchise certain groups of people from being seen and thus treated as fully human. Trans people are at risk of losing access to gender-affirming health care, as well as the right to determine their own gender identity on passports and other federal government documents. Government agencies like NASA have been ordered to scrub any DEI-related content from their websites and social media because it is an unnecessary and wasteful use of government resources. The real result is the erasure of the contributions and histories of women and people of color. The aggressive push to deport immigrants who are undocumented has led to people being detained without due process, as well as instances of immigrants who are here with legal documentation and even U.S. citizens being detained and questioned before it's all figured out. Arrest first, ask later. And there are accusations of racial profiling. This is instilling fear and anxiety in immigrant communities to the point that children aren't going to school and people are staying home. I can appreciate that people entering the country illegally puts huge strains on local, state, and federal resources, and that the immigration system is broken. I can appreciate that there is waste in the federal government. And I can appreciate that half the people in the country feel like their voices and concerns around the economy or access to jobs and education weren't being heard or taken seriously. But I also believe that there are ways to address these issues that do not require the vilification of whole groups of people. Dehumanizing others, especially those who are already on the margins, to make ourselves feel better is frankly cruel. And as of yet, it has not brought down the price of eggs. Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me, Jesus famously instructed his disciples. All human creatures are God's children, and those dearest to God are the ones who treat God's children kindly, said Muhammad. Unfortunately, our country is headed in the opposite direction of kindness and compassion. And unfortunately, because we are polarized, politicians are not willing or not able to work together to find common ground, to take first steps towards resolving some of the real issues and concerns around immigration and the economy and things like that. Reverend Martin Niemöller, author of our modern reading this morning, was a German theologian and pastor who initially supported the Nazi regime. A conservative Christian, he was anti-Semitic, and he feared the atheistic stance in communism. But when Hitler tried to oppose the Aryan clause on churches in Germany, which only allowed those of Aryan descent to be baptized, Niemöller joined Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Karl Barth, and many other German Protestant clergy in the founding of the Confessional Church to denounce the Nazification of the church as conflicting with Christian doctrine of baptism and the teachings of Jesus. Niemöller was arrested and sent to a concentration camp for 8 years. During that time, he made friends with his Jewish cellmate, Leo Stein, leading to his change of heart. After the war, he became a vocal advocate for human rights, having witnessed both in his country and within himself what can happen when we lose sight of each other's humanity, even across real differences. Undoing the damage being done right now is going to be slow and hard work. I know it's easy to get discouraged and overwhelmed, which of course is part of the strategy. But as people of Unitarian Universalist faith, we claim that every person is inherently worthy and has the right to flourish with dignity, love, and compassion. And we covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. So this is our time to rise to the occasion. This is our time to advocate, affirm, embody, and embrace the humanity of every person. Whatever a piece of paper might say about us or our neighbors, or whatever boxes or forms we or our trans siblings are forced to check, or whatever of our stories are removed from government websites, we will not define our own or each other's humanities by the smallness and cruelty of these things. Rather, we will do so through the relationships and the connections and the stories that make us human to one another. And we cannot allow fear to silence our speaking or our listening, our witnessing or accompaniment of one another and our neighbors. Like it or not, our world is intricately interconnected, and what initially affects the least of our siblings will eventually affect us all. The court in Poland has not yet made its final determination about the property, Kuba's property. So who knows where that will go. Given that I didn't even know about it, or half the documents the genealogists found existed, it doesn't connect me to him. Because the fact that I kept this little vanity case for nearly 60 years, given to me by this man I met once but never forgot, proves to me that he was real and that our relationship was real because he loved me. No document or court decision will ever change that truth.